Jody Daniels, who is the founder and CEO of Red Clover Advisories, a privacy consultancy, helping companies from startup to Fortune 100 create privacy programs, build customer trust, and achieve GDPR, CCPA, and other privacy laws, hopefully that we will not have state by state or country by country, but we shall see. Jody is a certified information privacy professional and serves the outsourced privacy office for companies. Jody has her BBA and MBA from the Cbuswaw School of Business at Emory University. So hopefully I said that right, Jody, and welcome. And I'm going to stop sharing this and turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much. And you did. It's Cbuswaw. It's one of the CEOs of Coke years ago. And for any of you familiar with Atlanta, it's also nicknamed Coke, and Emory itself is kind of nicknamed the Coca-Cola University. So there's your fun fact for the evening. We're all good. We can go now, right? Okay. Woohoo! All right, let me work on sharing my screen. It would not be a fun webinar if I was like, how do I do this? Okay, slide 2, screen 2, I think. No, that's not gonna work. Not screen 2, it says screen 2. Let's see if this works. Do you see my presentation or like something different?
We see it.
We see it, you're good to go.
Look at me. Because when I go to share, it actually says something different, which is why I'm always so confused. Okay. Hi, everyone. So glad that you are here this evening. Thank you so much for joining. So to get started, I have to disclose, fun things. We're going to talk about some laws. I'm not actually an attorney, so I'm not actually providing legal advice, but we're going to have a fun conversation. So now we can move along. So there's a little bit of like how we got here. How are we talking about privacy and the intersection of marketing and what's going on? Well, I love statistics, good analytics people. So I think it's kind of fun to look at what's happening. Well, we have 3 in 10 people using an ad blocker. That's a lot of people. So, 30% of the audience is not even going to see what you have because they've just already blocked it. And then we have 4 in 10 people saying, I might walk away from a company and not give them data because I don't feel comfortable with them. And then we have almost like a third to a fourth with a variety of other things. They want control. They want to be able to see the data, and they want to be able to choose what data is being shared. Now, some other statistics are one of my favorites. Almost 80% of people are concerned about how a company is collecting data. So at least 2 out of 10 people, warm and fuzzy about what a company is doing with data. That's not a very good statistic. That's kind of troubling, quite honestly. And as a result, half of people are saying, I'm not going to buy the product or service because I'm really concerned about what's going to happen with the personal information that they're going to get. And maybe like 10% of people are kind of trusting companies. So when you put all of that in a big pot, you're getting a sense that we have a problem, that companies have collected a significant amount of data, they're misusing it, they're not using it properly, and we have a massive imbalance of trust with the end audience. And how that manifests itself is the goal is to get people to buy whatever we're doing. We want people to come to our site, we want them to engage, we want them to buy. And if they're not comfortable with what's happening with the data, they're going to give us bad data to make it through to the next wall. So now we're going to analyze actually wrong data. Or they're going to skip us altogether, and now we have lost sales. And so enter the joy of some privacy laws. Now, to kind of get started, to understand privacy laws, it's really important to understand what we're even talking about regarding data. So there's personal data, and you're going to hear me talk about personal data and personal information kind of interchangeably. Personal data comes from GDPR, and right, I know you kind of mentioned hopefully not a state by state. Well, we're sort of 2 into 50 with 2 states. And so Virginia is also adopting the personal data concept, but they're generally interchangeable. And you think about contact information, financial, government identifiers, kind of your typical information. But where it gets fun is when we start adding in all the online identifiers. And soon we can put fingerprinting and all kinds of other ones that are here. Basically, any digital moniker that you can come up with to do some form of tracking is really often considered personal data because we're connecting it to something else. We're using it to profile. We're using it for targeting. We're using it for ads. We're using it in some form or fashion. Moons ago, it was anonymous data. You just had cookie 123 about me. You didn't know it was Jody. But we all know that you can connect all of that. You might have my IP with cookie 123. Someone else is able to connect the IP to who I am. And we're able to really have a lot more. And the slide I don't have in here, but that I often have is if you kind of imagined, when we were in the real world and we went to places like you went to the office and you went to coffee and you went to lunch and yoga and a meeting like this in person. Imagine someone's following you the whole time. And they're tracking and making a note of everything that you're doing. They have, I love the cat, Katie. It's super cute. It's showing up on my screen. That was great. So kind of imagine like you have a flip pad and someone's noting all of the things that you're doing and what kind of coffee you had and what you had for lunch and where you went and how far it all was. You'd probably turn around to that person and say, what on earth are you doing? But that's what we're doing online. And we didn't really think anything of it. Well, a variety of people think something of it based on all the stats that I just shared, and the privacy laws have kind of swooped in to try and take control and make companies be transparent with what's actually going on and give consumers choices. So all of this is now in scope for, and many other examples, but the online data is also now considered personal data or personal information. Now, some of you, this might be relevant, but I just wanted to introduce this concept of sensitive data. And under GDPR, it's also kind of considered special categories. So we have two other laws here. I know I haven't introduced them yet. We're going to talk about them in a moment. But this is sort of a comparison list. And if you look at it, you can see at the top, there's a lot of qualitative concepts: religious, race, political affiliations. Those aren't all quantitative, super specific metrics. I mean, we put them together and make them that way, right? But if you think about it, the privacy actually emanated from, especially in Europe, after World War II. And if you think about all the data that can be used to profile someone and what kind of happened, you can understand how some of this could really harm someone's individual rights and freedoms. And that's actually the whole point of privacy. It's my data, and I want to know what you're doing with it. I should get to be able to control it, and I need to make sure that it's not going to be used in a way that can harm me. And so again, if you had some of these, like let's take, race, and you had enough data, someone could do something with that and potentially harm somebody. You can see a long list of others because it's kind of been misused at this time. So sensitive data has a variety of very special rules associated with it if you're using it in any form or fashion, collecting it, using it for targeting, lots of rules kind of around it. And that's what I want you to leave here today, is just like antennas at the top of your head. If you're using any of that, there's some extra things you have to pay attention to. So let's have a crash course, shall we, in some privacy laws. GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. If we all were gathered here together, I'd ask everyone to raise your hand if you knew about it or you've had to deal with it. So we're not quite there yet. I can see like 5 of you. Oh, I see one, Brian. Thank you for raising your hand. Basically, this is actually going to celebrate its 3rd birthday. We're moving into toddlerville, like the middle of toddlerhood, in May, being enforced. And it applies. What's important is that there's no minimums. Nonprofit solo bloggers in Tahiti with bubbly drinks, anyone who is targeting people in the EU and trying to sell them something or monitor them is in scope. You don't have to have a physical presence in the EU. And if you're a service provider, so you're like a B2B business providing services for other people, you might be in scope because your clients are asking you to be in scope. So just something to kind of consider. And there's so much, we could have an entire session on GDPR, but we can't do that. So if you have your favorite GDPR questions, save them for the Q&A section. What often gets missed though, when we're talking about EU privacy is the e-privacy. Now, I actually have here the regulation. There's technically a directive here today. It's been trying to get updated forever. It was supposed to be 3 years ago. We're still arguing over it. All the EU countries have to agree. So if you think 50 states here is kind of hard, they all have to agree as individual countries over there. But these are some of the themes kind of coming out of the e-privacy piece. And if you kind of put the text rules like TCPA, CAN-SPAM, the Digital Advertising Alliance, you smushed them all together, it's kind of the equivalent of e-privacy. It actually controls the digital marketing. But then you have to match it up with GDPR. GDPR is processing. E-privacy has its kind of own rules for the actual digital marketing. So there's an intersection with both of those. If you have a cookie banner, you actually have to look at both. If you're sending email marketing, you have to look at both. For example, email marketing in Germany, it's a double opt-in. That comes from Germany's kind of view of an interpretation of the e-privacy directive. GDPR doesn't say double opt-in, just says you need a legal basis for it. So know that there's this other law that is out there. Now, let's bring us back home to the United States. Our lovely favorite, CCPA, enters California Consumer Privacy Act. It was effective and enforceable in 2020, and it's the most comprehensive privacy law of its kind here in the United States, but it was not nearly as strict as GDPR. Now, if you want the backstory to that, that's really a cocktail conversation. It's a really fascinating story, and it introduces a variety of individual rights, meaning Jody could ask for you to delete my data. Jody could ask you to tell me what data you have on me. In the privacy notice, you have to have a long list of requirements. You have to disclose all kinds of things. And the biggest one that affects marketers is the concept of do not sell my personal information. And we're going to hold that thought because last November, our friends in California voted not only for a president, but they also voted for a new privacy law. And it passed in November of 2020. And we need more acronyms here. It's called CPRA, the California Consumer Privacy Rights and Enforcement Act. And so this particular, you know what, this is terrible. I need to fix this slide because it says the California Privacy Rights Act, which is kind of right. But this updates and amends CCPA. So if you kind of imagined 0 to 10, 10 being GDPR as sort of the gold standard in privacy, every state except for California is basically at a 0. We don't have a whole lot. CCPA, in my view, kind of moved us up to like a 5. CPRA moves us up to probably a 7 or an 8. We're not quite at GDPR for everything, but we are for quite a lot. There is requirements for certain situations with proper consent using GDPR's consent standard. There are more individual rights that line up to what GDPR's are. So there's now about 10 to 11 individual rights. We have sensitive data that was introduced. You need a business purpose to be able to use the data. But unlike GDPR, which kind of gave you 6 lawful bases to be able to use it, consent, contract, legal obligation, legitimate interest, public authority, and vital interest, we just have business purpose. But companies are going to have to go through and figure out what that means. Now, this is where it gets fun and the intersection for marketers. There's this idea of selling and sharing. Today, under CCPA, we have selling. Now, many of you might say, I don't sell my data. Aha. But in the world of ad tech, it's basically been interpreted that it's selling of data. So when we're using Facebook and we're using Google Ads and we're using DSPs and pick your other favorite acronym, that the other party is using that to help build their algorithm. And so the data has been shared with the third party for the benefit of the ad, but they're also using it to build their own analytics or their own algorithms. And as a result, that is a sale of data. If we were to have this webinar, none of you opted in, but Tim and Brian gave me all your emails, they might have just sold the data to me because it wasn't consumer directed. So it can show up in like joint webinars. Think about a conference when we used to go to those in person. Now we're still virtual. And ever notice you get emails all day long from the people that are sponsoring it because it was part of their cool package? That might have been a sale of data depending on how it was orchestrated. Lots of requirements. You have to opt out, have to be able to follow the whole path all the way from you down to all your service providers. Sharing is now another concept, and think cross-device targeting. So under sharing, you're going to have to be able to allow someone to opt out specifically of cross-device. Now let's move across to the East Coast. Welcome, Virginia. Earlier this year, that passed. It's the second most comprehensive privacy law, and it kind of smushes together CPRA with GDPR. So similar requirements, but also just a little bit nuanced. So we're not going to go into all the crazy nuances here. Just know that January 2023 for these two states is going to be very busy. And if you, again, don't have to have like a physical operation in those two states, but if you have customers in those states, you're going to want to pay attention and get more details about what it means for you in those states. Now, you might ask me, well, what about more states? Are more states coming? Brian wants 50 states. I know he's really excited. You can see here lots of blue. I know, Brian, I was kidding. You can see lots of blue here. I can tell you Oklahoma died. And Washington, we will know next week. Washington has another saving grace where it might be able to be reviewed this weekend. Washington's back for the third time. If it doesn't make it this weekend, I can assure you it's coming back next year for the fourth time. And the thing will keep coming back, I'm convinced, until it passes. But you have a lot of other states here. Florida got watered down, but moved forward. So Florida is probably like the next closest one. And lots of blue. And if we came back every year, we're going to have a lot more red and more states that will be blue. No political references. That will keep moving through here, how this is moving along. And then people always ask me about a federal law. Federal law has been introduced almost every year, multiple ones. Every time we still have no federal law. Maybe one day. So given all these laws, what happens if you don't comply? Well, you could just choose to ignore them all, and you might find some fines. Someone can turn you in. Maybe someone fines you. There's some egregious activity. So there's fines. There's always a hook. But more important, well, first off, you could have your data not protected. There could be a data breach. And under a data breach, there is an individual private right of action in California. If your data is not redacted, not encrypted, so big email list that you sent over to an agency, not encrypted, not redacted, ends up with a data breach, it could, and if it qualifies as a data breach, that could be a massive lawsuit. So take security very seriously. Now, more importantly, and connecting to the first part of our conversation is around loss of trust and loss of sales. Because if I don't, two ways. If I don't trust you as a company, I might not do business with you, as we saw in the very beginning. If you're in the B2B space, I've seen time and again where a company asks, tell me about your privacy practices. And you're like, well, I don't know. We don't really do that. You might lose the sale. I'm going to go to the next page. If we think about all of our landing pages, and we're going to be talking about all the great features that we have, here's where we want to talk about privacy as a security or as a feature. Because when someone's coming to our website and they're looking at it, this is now one of the things that they're looking for. And so this is an opportunity for us that we're going to talk about. So what does it mean for you? The first thing is you have got to know your data. You need to know everywhere where your data is. First, it's required now by GDPR in just about every law, where you have to have documentation that explains what you're doing. For California, you have to know if it qualifies for a sale, if it qualifies for sharing of data. Under Virginia, they care only about actual sales for money, but you need to actually know that. They also care about targeted advertising, and there's special rules for targeted advertising. So the only way we can achieve this and make sure all of our vendors are also complying with our laws is if we know where our data is. So you want to start with a data inventory. It can be as simple as a basic Excel spreadsheet that I've given to people many times, or fancy with privacy management software. But somehow just get started with documenting what you're doing with the data and kind of the data life cycle as it goes through. And kind of another piece is, I just thought it would be really helpful for this audience is to dig a little bit into GDPR. So one of the big pieces on GDPR is basically that it's basically kind of against like building profiles without the person's consent and using this type of information in an automated fashion and then storing any of that in a really unsafe manner. A lot of companies are kind of moving to synonymous data, trying to sort of bridge the gap between Jody and like just 1, 2, 3, but somehow still being able to have a record of that. So kind of thinking about like cookie matching and frequency targeting and programmatic ads, GDPR is very much an opt-in philosophy. And then from there, you need to have proper disclosures in your privacy notice. The other question I get a lot is opt-in. Like, what does opt-in look like? A couple years ago, 3 years ago at this time, our inboxes were flooded with, please opt into my emails. Please opt into my emails. I need to keep talking to you. Well, that's a whole interesting thing, because that's not really how you opt in. And no joke, someone asked me the other day, how can I email the people on my list who have opted out to ask them to opt back in? So I see some nods. We can't quite do it that way. There's some creative ways of how we can solve for that and push people to try and get people to opt in. But don't send an email now asking them to opt in. We don't do that. So what does it look like? Freely given, which means I'm not forced to signing in for your thing as well as buying whatever it is you want. They need to be separate. Join your mailing list, fabulous. Separate from whatever thing it is I'm trying to do on your site. It's an open box. I actually have to check the box. You didn't check it for me. I have to be able to withdraw it. And a quick note on that, unsubscribe is not the same as the right to delete. The right to delete means you go into MailChimp and delete me from your whole system, which is very different from just unsubscribe. And then you really should have a privacy notice that explains what you're doing in the first place. Cookie banners, I kind of mentioned this a little bit. It's really an opt-in from a GDPR perspective. Now, many of you are probably seeing cookie banners like I am, especially in the United States. You should not have accept with nothing next to it, because I don't accept if I can't reject or change them. That's not accepting. That's like forced acceptance. You could do okay. You can do got it. Companies here are using a cookie banner because they want to, or because they didn't separate. You can do an EU one versus a US or even just a California one. There are many companies who feel very strongly, especially in California, given the focus on ad tech, to have a banner that explains what you're doing and allow them to manage their cookie settings there. That helps kind of address the do not sell piece. You still have to have a do not sell link in the footer of your homepage. But from a cookie perspective, it's opt-in in the EU, and it's generally opt-out in the United States. And really do pay attention to what the language is that you're using in the banner. Again, this is part of the user experience. And please, 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 when you have a cookie banner, think about your mobile experience. I can't tell you how many sites I personally go to, and I can't get to the mobile page because the cookie thing's all over the place. I'm forced to accept, there's no X. Am I happy? Is that a good customer experience? No, I'm kind of mad at you. And I might even leave because I just want to get to your site. Kind of just a friendly reminder about cross-device tracking. In CPRA world, I need to be able to opt out of that. So as you're building and thinking about your plans for this year and next, be mindful of that. I'm sure you're all paying close attention to the world of cookieless. In fact, I think just in the last week, more information has come out around the timing for Apple's big release. And all the browsers are kind of moving in this direction. I'm sure if you've read, Google has kind of introduced their flock as what they're thinking about. But if you don't like it now, I'm sure it'll change next month. It's continuing to iterate. If you have the opportunity, you can participate in some of those discussions. What is interesting, though, is this idea of global privacy control. I don't know if anyone here has kind of heard of it. It's sort of a modern day version of do not track, but that's trying to gain some traction. And the California Attorney General on a tweet actually supported global privacy control as being in compliance with the California law. So then people were saying, well, he said it on Twitter, so look, that's accepted. It's really fascinating how Twitter's working these days. But it'll kind of still be, it'll be interesting to see what will happen, because the site still has to honor what the browser setting is. It doesn't work. So if everyone goes to the global privacy control in their settings and marks that don't track, but then all the sites ignore it, we're kind of back to the same thing as we were 10 years ago with do not track. But there's this concept of global privacy control to try and allow, instead of the 4,000 cookie banners that everyone is having all day long, to try and do this at a browser setting. So again, kind of invite you to pay attention to what will happen there. So what are your options? Well, I firmly believe marketing responsibly will help you gain more customers, will help you retain current customers, and will help you make sure that you get accurate data. Because the worst thing you want is, Mickey Mouse in your email address. And when you're asking for questions, I make up a bunch of things because I just want to get through whatever gate it is that you have to be able to get the content. So we want to be thinking responsibly. We want to look at the privacy laws, what they're asking of us. And so with that being said, there's kind of this can and can't, and then should and shouldn't. So think about the privacy laws, and you're going to ask or work with your teams and say, can I use this data? And if the answer is no, you're kind of back to the drawing board, to the next creative idea. If the answer is yes, I invite you to ask yourselves, should you use the data or shouldn't you use the data? What does your customer think about it? We all want to sell. We all want to make money for our companies. We also want to create long-term, loyal, returning, happy customers with a good customer experience. And privacy is now a big part of how that's going to happen. And I believe we can do that through privacy, through marketing messaging, the language we're using. So think about your products and your features. Do you have a whole page explaining, here's all the wonderful things? Oh, let me also tell you about how we're using your data. Maybe it's a privacy portal where Microsoft does a really nice job. I recognize it's a big company, but I think even small companies can model after that, where it's very visual. I can click and understand, here's the individual rights section. Here's what's happening with my data. It's a very visual experience. I write the long, boring privacy notices. And at the same time, we can move that upwards into a good, solid user experience. And when we're doing kind of a landing page, when we're asking for information, when we're going to be using different cookies, think about the customer, think about them first, and understand, well, what could their objections be? And how can I use language to help me alleviate that and kind of lure them in? And especially in a cookieless world, we're going to want to have more emails. We might start using emails as identifiers. We might go to third-party companies who are using identity solutions, and maybe we can even augment that with our personal data. So as we move to more first-party data, I think this piece is going to be even more important. And so ultimately, we're trying to build trust. I think you can do that through privacy notices. You can have privacy notices on privacy portals. All the laws say you have to be super thorough and make them easy to read and, common language. They're still long, they're still cumbersome, which is why I really think that the kind of user experience, if you broke it down into a very visual way, Apple's going to try it with the nutrition label, can really help connect you with your customers. This I just thought was kind of a fun slide that talked a little bit, some of you, and actually InfoTrust is a sponsor here, right? That's talking about kind of cookieless and anonymous and Google Analytics, just sort of an example of what the experience might look like, where you have, user consents, the cookie is reviewed, and it kind of continues on of what you're able to receive sort of in each scenario. So you'll have these slides. You can go to InfoTrust and grab more information. But I wanted to sort of to share this here. And kind of the last big part I have is we're moving into other territories. So device fingerprinting, demographic, deterministic, browsing histories, all of these are trying to be used all the time. You have some companies working with agencies in China trying to circumvent Apple. Think about kind of going to that can and can't and should and shouldn't. Ultimately, the privacy laws are trying to catch up with where technology's been and where consumers are frustrated. If you have a third of people blocking cookies, it's because they don't like how it's being done. So to circumvent them is just doing the same thing, but without cookies. And I'm not advocating that we shouldn't use marketing technology, not at all. I'm advocating to think about the customer first, make sure you're clear, make sure you understand what's actually happening and how you're really connecting with your audience, with your customer, and is it in the best interest of you, the brand, and the customer? Literally right before this, someone was asking in a group I'm in, what's the best tool to cold email 10,000 people and on text messaging? And so then a bunch of other people were saying, well, like, do you have opt-in consent? Why are you going to spam them? Or if you're going to use email, you're going to get blasted because no one, are these valid emails? Over time, people are going to unsubscribe. Then you're going to be banned from the system, right? It's not a good experience. There's something for sort of the one-to-one. There's something for all the technology, but kind of think about those types of experiences so you find the right solution that will work for your business. Because ultimately, privacy is all about engaging with your customers at the right level for your organization to build long-lasting relationships of trust. And companies who are going to pay attention to privacy are going to win. And if you didn't join us at the very beginning, I had kind of shared in our little pre-chat that someone earlier had mentioned we're on a privacy train, and the intersection of marketing and privacy is here. We're going to test, we're going to learn, we're going to keep iterating, and we're just going to keep on going on this crazy fast train. I think it's more like a roller coaster, and it's going to go really fast, and it's going to go up, and it's going to go in all different types of directions as more states keep passing and more technologies keep coming out. We try them and we adjust. And so to really get your big harness on and get ready for the roller coaster that we have. So that's what I have. I did, you can grab these slides if Tim kind of shares them or Brian shares them, but I also kind of created a special URL where there's a variety of different resources that you can have. There's a data inventory Excel sheet there. And then the link is actually hyperlinked as well in the slides. And would love to answer any questions that you have.
Awesome. Thank you, Jody. So yeah, please put those questions in the chat. And I'm going to start out with the one and only question that's been asked by Michael here. Would you please talk more about Apple's nutrition label? And do you think Google will be forced to adopt it or something similar?
Sure. So Apple's introduced this nutrition label for mobile apps that they need to disclose basically all the data and what's happening with it. So you're collecting what type of data and you're using it for what purpose, and it's kind of being shared with what type of third-party service providers in the App Store. So as you're introducing a new app or trying to renew it, you have to submit that information to be able to make it through. Do I think Google will be forced to do something? In the Android store, they might. I think it depends on the adoption rate and how well it's perceived. So I'm not sure I would use the word forced because Apple's doing it because Apple's doing it. They believe firmly in privacy. They're kind of frustrated with the industry, frustrated with regulation. And so they're going forward in their philosophy and views. Google's joined. I will say what's kind of interesting is a lot of the large tech companies, especially in the EU and especially Google, if you follow them, you'll see that there's a lot of antitrust lawsuits against them, and antitrust actually ends up intersecting with privacy. So Google's position on privacy, they kind of have to be here to try and help their position so that they aren't seen as an anti-competitive monopoly in some of those areas. So the forced might be to help that posture, in my personal opinion. But we'll have to I think they're going to wait and see a little bit more of how it works before they roll something out.
Excellent. So I have a question for you. With the latest, upgrades to the GDPR law that just came out, the position was that Google Analytics is not truly anonymous, right? It still, has artifacts in it that they could, connect to users. So, they basically said, hey, when you go to a website and you accept cookies or reject cookies, even the measurement cookies have to be rejected as well. Do you see, as we go into it's hard to compare the GDPR to the US, but, I'm trying to alleviate the fears of the US marketers as I have to deal with the fears of the European marketers that I deal with. Do you see, Google is obviously understanding this problem, but, with the challenge is if you have 50 different, GDPR style pieces of legislation for each state, everything could be different. So, how do you truly look at an anonymous style of collecting information that actually helps the user, like with analytics and personalization and things like that, versus, just saying, well, if I reject all the cookies, as a marketer, I have no visibility into what's happening.
Right. So my first thought is, here in the United States, I don't think, first off, California and Virginia have not gone with an opt-in approach when it comes to cookies. They've gone in an opt-in. The closest is going to be opt-in for sensitive data for geolocation in Virginia. So geolocation falls as a sensitive data field, like precise geolocation, not IP inferred, but you want to know my latitude and longitude. And I've heard lawyers say it's within 1,600 feet of where I am as their measure of preciseness. Whether that's exactly right, I'm not sure. I'm not. The US is still a very capitalistic focused country. And as much as we have laws in place, it's still kind of business first. I mean, it's notice, it's choices, but it's not a whole lot of opt-in. And the business purpose is still, I have to have a business purpose. Otherwise, I have to tell you what the next business purpose is going to be or ask you for it. I'm not sure we're going to really have a whole lot of states do opt-in. If all the states that I showed you, there were 1 or 2 that had opt-in. Oklahoma was actually opt-in for the sale of data. And it had the sale of data definition the same as California's, which would have put ad tech into that bucket. It died. And I don't see a whole lot of other states really adopting the opt-in here. I think we're still very much an opt-out philosophy. So someone could absolutely prove me wrong, but I think for the United States, we're going to stay there.
Yeah, I hope that is the case for sure. And certainly with the evolution of Google Analytics 4, less cookieless environment, I think it's going to be helpful for everybody, even GDPR. So.
Yeah, I mean, you never know, right? A state can surprise you. Politics are at play underneath all of this. You also have a lot of lobbyists that are involved in all of these types of things. So there's always can be a monkey wrench. I would say, generally speaking, it I think will remain opt-out, at least for the foreseeable future, or until someone does something else nefarious. I mean, we're very reactive. So if there is some other massive thing that happens, that might change the answer.
Cambridge Analytica.
And that is how we got to CCPA. There's still a really fascinating backstory to that, but that is how we got there.
So Tim has a question. Are there cases where different privacy regulations actually conflict with each other? Or is there always an option to go with the most restrictive approach?
That's a really great question. There are actually some cases, especially around the world, where they don't always work. Like in some countries, they don't like the legal basis of legitimate interest, but like that's kind of the basis that they might use everywhere else. So there are a few where that happens, and companies kind of need to pick the best option, document it, and kind of go from there. For those in the United States, there's not necessarily a lot of conflict, but there are differences. So it will remain to be seen how privacy notices are going to work as we think about a global company that's going to have GDPR, California, and Virginia. And there are differences that need to happen. So that's going to be kind of interesting to see how that's going to work out. Today, one of those kinds of companies would have a GDPR section and typically a California section, and that's sort of it. It's kind of a lot to keep having all these other states and like trying to line up. I mean, you saw even the sensitive data, right? So they're all kind of different what the sensitive data is, and that's just sort of one example. Or the individual rights are a little bit different. So generally, though, I would say that companies go with the most restrictive. So they're looking to kind of try and operationalize privacy. They will pick what is going to work at an operational level, which tends to be the most conservative approach, because then they know that they're solid.
Yeah, Tim. So a great example of that would be France. So Tony is asking, is there a profit incentive to enforce the regulations? Meaning, will there be law firms in California or other states that make their money from pursuing actions against companies outside of California, i.e. class action lawsuits, those types of things?
I don't think you necessarily would have it be outside of California versus inside California, because it doesn't really matter where you are. It's all about having to comply with the law. So whether Jody's in Georgia or Jody's in California, if I have California customers and I meet the requirements. So one thing, I didn't go crazy deep, but both of the California and Virginia law have some minimum thresholds to comply. What I will offer is, even if you're underneath the threshold, one, the end customer has no idea that there's a threshold. So they're going to still look at you and not know you're a small company versus a big company. That is especially true in a B2B environment. And I literally had a client call today where one of our service providers said, well, our counsel told us that we're too small. We don't have to comply with CCPA. And I said, okay, but if you're going to be our service provider, you have to comply with CCPA. So there's that. And now they have to figure out how to comply with CCPA. So I don't think there's necessarily a profit incentive for just being outside. There are going to be law firms and plaintiffs' attorneys waiting to pounce on a data breach. So they are going to be scouring the data breach announcements and looking for those, because if you had to announce that you have a data breach and you likely have people in California, then there is a significant potential they can sue under the CCPA, because there's an individual private right of action.
Awesome. Christina asked, hi, Jody, great presentation. Thanks so much. You went through this, but just to clarify, for websites that have a cookie banner, the default option should be to opt out versus set to opt in and drop the cookies once the user clicks accept. For
a site that is US only, you can have it opt out. I mean, some sites choose to have it opt in, but you don't have to have it that way. You can make a US site opt out and make sure that you have the ability to manage the cookies. I would personally not use accept unless you literally right next to accept have manage cookie settings or reject. Because if you just have accept, I don't actually accept. Like, what if I reject? What am I supposed to do? Hit accept, then go find your privacy notice and find the settings. It's not a good experience. So you can typically do like, got it, okay, I love cookies, manage. There's a lot of different words that you can use. So I hope that that clarifies. If you're in the EU though, it's the reverse. So if you're in the EU, it needs to be default opt-in, which is why having a cookie tool to be able to help you manage those experiences is really helpful.
Yes, and you know, definitely having GDPR states you have to have an accept or reject right next to each other, same button color and all that fun stuff. So Andy asked, you mentioned Microsoft as an interesting experience for US focused companies, non-GDPR. Are there any other companies you would point to as a model for the best practices with how they choose to handle and manage privacy experience for their customers?
Yeah, so, well, first, I think Microsoft can still be a great example, even if there's no GDPR. So just the concept of how they lay it out, because it's just a very visual experience. And it's, oh, you want to learn more about privacy? Click here. You want to understand more about our products? Click here. You might have one product and it can be very simple. It's just very, very visual. And so I think that's why I use it so much as an example. There are some others, but they're obviously not as top of mind because I can't remember exactly who they are. So yes, but I don't remember them at the moment. The key is right now, most companies just have, here's my privacy notice, click on it, and it's a long document. People like me write them. And so then in there, it's, you know, here's individual rights. And it's just long in text. You're starting to see some people who do hyperlinks. That's better. It's at least a step forward. But imagine you had like squares, almost, you know, a PowerPoint presentation where you had like big squares. And here's a summary of what you collect. And here's a summary of how we use it. And another of, here's your individual rights. And how about my favorite, a preference center? Save your unsubscribe, do a downgrade model. Let me choose how often, or even if you have multiple things, do you have text? Do you have catalogs? Do you have email? Allow all of that to be in a preference center. So maybe some of you have like universal consent managers. You can have all that on a privacy page.
Yeah, and I think one of the other challenges with that, and kind of piggybacks on Andy's question, is that the user gets presented, and the user is just your everyday average person. They get if they do want to manage their preferences, they get targeting cookies. Do I want those or do not want those? Do I want performance? Do I want audience measurement? So you get all these things. So you have to be very plain speak about what these things actually are and what they mean for the user, so that when they're trying to manage their preferences, they can yeah, I'm okay with why I want to select these or not select these. So I think, Andy, that's another good rule of thumb, is just to make sure that you're not kind of just totally confusing somebody. So I'm just going to decline all this stuff. But you can have strictly necessary cookies that are needed to operate any website. So
that is a fair point. Thank you, Brian, for pointing that out. Yes, and not all cookies are created equal.
Yeah, and Jody had a great point earlier about documenting. So there is certainly, and Doug calls us out as well. So you have GDPR and CNIL, which is kind of the French version of GDPR. There's contradictions between those two laws, and so as marketers, we have to go in there and document, okay, this is what you're saying, but here's what I need to do to run my website properly. So if they do come back to us, we can say, well, I have a case to present back to you. It's not just this is the law. They are flexible to say, okay, well, why did you do this? And prove to me. Like Tesco was a great example in the EU, where they literally just ignored GDPR, and they got fined millions of dollars. And there was another company that was similar to them, that's like the Lowe's of Europe, and they actually documented out, here's exactly why we did all this. And they said, oh, well, that makes sense to us. So, documenting your process and capturing specific parts of the rule that, you were saying, well, I'm a service-based business. Because remember, these are, generally politicians and lawmakers that are writing these things. They don't understand the digital world. So they can, they look at everything as the same. Well, of course, everybody wants to, just have cookies to accept them or not. But I mean, it can have, genuine consequences on the experience from both sides of the coin too.
Yeah, I would just love to echo what you said, Brian. And it's so important that data inventory is where you capture this and you have that documentation. A company that actually put forth some effort is going to get a much greater pass if they misclassified or someone disagrees with what they've done, than a company who said, well, I just didn't, I don't know, we did that 3 years ago. Aren't we done by now?
Right. Yes, and you constantly have to run scans to make sure that because you're always adding new cookies and things like that that are falling into the right categories as well. So
exactly.
All right. Well, if we don't have any more questions, Tim, we can jump over to the breakout rooms. And I think the plan is Jody's going to stay in the main breakout room if anyone does have any other questions. But it's kind of a great time to meet with others and network a little bit and share some stories.